I think it's pretty fair to say that what we do as contemporary composers doesn't get a lot, if any, mainstream attention. You might occasionally get a story or a piece or a composer that breaks through, but you can probably make a pretty good assumption that most people, and most classical music lovers, won't have heard of Boulez or Ligeti or Boulanger or Unsuk Chin or Thomas Addis, or probably any modern or contemporary composer. But they will certainly recognise this. This, of course, is the album cover to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the Beatles' 8th album. It is probably one of the most famous album covers ever made. And at the top, slightly to the left, close to Carl Jung and Lenny Bruce, we have one of the most influential figures in avant-garde music, Karlheinz Stockhausen. But the question is, how did the composer of this end up on a Beatles album cover? I think to understand this, we have to go back 4 years before the release of Sgt. Pepper. This is Love Me Do, the Beatles' debut single and one of the tracks on their first album, Please Please Me. Like a lot of their early songs, Love Me Do is driven by catchy melodies, more conventional triadic tonal harmony, and a reasonably regular approach to writing songs. But over a relatively short period of time, in a matter of only a few years, their sound completely changed. Albums like Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper and the White Album contained songs that were no longer designed to work outside the recording studio. Their approach became one that was purely artistic and intrinsically experimental. They became pioneers of new recording techniques, developed novel ways of writing music, and experimented with sound worlds that had never been heard before in the mainstream. This description could just as well be applied to what was going on in the avant-garde contemporary classical scene in the 40s, 50s and 60s. Composers such as Stockhausen, Berio, Cage and Varese were producing sonic worlds of immense depth and variety, and creating works of art that were breaking new ground in music. Stockhausen in particular was forging paths in the electronic world. His works in the beginning in this area involved exclusively electronic sounds. Here's an example, his Studie 2. This piece is made entirely by manipulating electronic sound, but he would eventually go on to combine this with pre-recorded acoustic sound. This approach was called Musik concrete. Here's an example, Stockhausen's Gesang der Jünglinge, Song of the Youths, where he matches a pre-recorded treble voice with electronic sounds. The techniques that Stockhausen used to create this and all his electronic works weren't made and used by other composers, but they were taken to extremes by Stockhausen. Here's what some of these techniques are. Overdubbing, where multiple recordings of the same track are played on top of each other. This often creates a saturated feeling. Playing tracks backwards or playing tracks faster or slower. Looping, where a track is played multiple times back to back. Panning, where the audio source that a particular track is being produced from is altered. Sampling, where recordings of instruments, voices or found sounds are mixed with other electronic or acoustic sounds, as well as a number of other techniques which allow you to manipulate the properties of a sound. Stockhausen's music had a direct influence on the Beatles, and you can hear a number of these techniques being used in their songs. In I'm Only Sleeping, from the 1966 album Revolver, the guitar solo is played backwards, although it was designed to be played forwards. This is a process known as backmasking. Eleanor Rigby, the second track on the album, contains inspired use of a string octet, which has been mic'd very closely to create a gritty, edgy feel to the sound. The vocals have also been panned in different directions in the verse compared to the chorus. Then there's Tomorrow Never Knows, the last track on the album but the first to be recorded. The song is based on a single C major chord inspired by Indian raga music, but with multiple tape loops played over the top. These loops were created by removing the erase head on the reel-to-reel tape machine, and then by feeding the tapes back into the machine, they overdubbed themselves, creating a saturated, dense texture. The loops were then sped up, slowed down, or reversed. In total, there are 6 loops used on Tomorrow Never Knows: a distorted recording of Paul McCartney laughing, an orchestra playing a B-flat major chord, 2 sets of phrases played on a mellotron synthesizer, a finger rubbing the rim of a wine glass, and a distorted sitar. This level of experimentation continued and was expanded in Sgt. Pepper. There was extensive use of sampling and randomization of sound in Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. To create the feeling of a carnival, George Martin used old tapes of steam organs playing Stars and Stripes Forever and other Sousa marches, chopped the tapes up, and then asked Jeff Emmerich to reassemble them at random. This is the result. But it's the final track on Sgt. Pepper that is my favourite Beatles song. A Day in the Life is not only an incredibly well-structured track, it was also, at the time it was released, one of the most experimental pieces of popular music ever written. The piece combines 2 separate songs, one written by John Lennon and the other by Paul McCartney, both of them unfinished fragments. The most astonishing part of this song is how these fragments are linked. In between each section is an enormous 24-bar orchestral tutti. 40 orchestral musicians were asked to play an atonal rising scale with a huge crescendo. This was an idea of Paul McCartney's, but it was realised by George Martin, who explains, "What I did there was to write the lowest possible note for each of the instruments in the orchestra. At the end of the 24 bars, I wrote the highest note near a chord of E major. Then I put a line right through the 24 bars, with reference points to tell them roughly what note they should have reached during each bar. When it came to recording this part, they realised that they actually wanted more sound than the 40 musicians could provide, and took the ingenious decision to record the orchestral section multiple times, eventually overdubbing 4 separate recordings of the crescendo. What is produced is one of the most fascinating uses of an orchestra in a popular song, as well as being completely immense." There was an enormous amount of experimentation that went into the creation of these songs, but the pinnacle of the development of their experimental sound did not come until 1968, a year after the release of Sgt. Pepper. The White Album, a double-sided album, contains the longest song ever released by the Beatles, Revolution 9. This piece can only be described as pure, avant-garde musique concrète. It is a sound collage made up of a number of sampled sounds that are faded in and out, with some repeated motifs such as the piano theme in B minor that you hear at the beginning, as well as the repeated number 9. The samples come from many different sources. This includes Beatles songs such as A Day in the Life and Tomorrow Never Knows, the final chord from Sibelius' 7th Symphony, the finale of Schumann's Symphonic Studies played backwards, parts of Beethoven's Choral Fantasy, a motet by Vaughan Williams, as well as multiple spoken, whispered, hummed and sung lines played forwards and backwards, panned and looped. It is astonishing, inventive and unbelievably similar to a number of pieces by avant-garde composers working at the fringes of classical music during exactly the same period. Here's how John Lennon described the construction of the piece.
I had a lot of loops, tape loops, which is just a circle of tape. If people who don't understand it, it repeats itself over and over. Had about 10 of them on different mono machines, all spinning at once with pencils and things holding them. I had a basic track, which was the end of the Revolution song, where we'd gone on and on and on and on. And I just played it sort of live into another tape and just brought them in on faders like you do as a DJ, and brought them in like that. And it was accidental in that way. I think I did it twice maybe, and the second one was the take.
The Beatles embody everything that all composers strive for in their working life. That desire to create something new. New sounds, new techniques, new philosophies. But they, like all great artists, realise that this can only be achieved by extending and building upon the work of others. As composers, we are indebted to every woman and man that has pushed the boundaries of possibility in music. The Beatles are indebted to the Avant-Garde. They have built upon the work of Stockhausen, but at the same time they have created a completely unique, inimitable, experimental sound that will undoubtedly inspire artists and composers for generations to come.
Did a big sort of epic recording of it with a big full orchestra and everything, you know, and then did that crescendo thing in the middle of it with the orchestra, which was an idea I'd had because I've been talking to people and reading about sort of avant-garde music, kind of atonal stuff, crazy ideas. And I came up with this idea. I said to the orchestra, you should start, all of you, which they're all looking at me puzzled. We've got a real symphony orchestra in London who are used to playing, you know, Beethoven. And here's me, so this crazy guy out of a group. And I'm saying, what you got to do is everyone start on the lowest note that your instrument could play and work your way up to the highest at your own pace. Just if you want to go, that's fine. Or, you know, that was too puzzling for them. And they're all looking at me. And orchestras don't like that kind of thing. They like it written down, and they like to know exactly what they're supposed to do. So George Martin, the producer, realized that. He kept the random aspect, but he said to the people, you should be about this note at this point in the song.